What would happen if the world's largest economy stumbled from its pedestal? It sounds like a Hollywood doomsday plot, the mighty United States losing its economic crown. But history tells us that even the greatest empires do fall, and usually not overnight. In this video we'll journey through past empires to see how each dominant economy eventually gave way to another. We'll explore why the US is not immune to this cycle, and how its decline might unfold gradually, rather than in a fiery crash. Stick around till the end, because we'll reveal a surprising silver lining about America's future in a post-US-led world that you might not expect. History has a clear message. No empire stays on top forever. Great powers gain economic dominance and then, sooner or later, decline, making way for new leaders. Don't believe it? Let's look at a few famous examples. The Dutch Golden Age. In the 17th century, the Netherlands was a superstar, a tiny nation of traders and tulip enthusiasts that dominated global commerce and finance. But its primacy didn't last. By the 18th century, the Dutch had been overtaken by a new powerhouse, the British Empire, the ultimate example of global dominance. At its height, Britain controlled about 23% of the world's population and 24% of Earth's land, the largest empire in history. They proudly said, "The sun never sets on the British Empire," because somewhere on the planet British colonies were always in daylight. The Soviet Union. Not all falls from power are slow. The Soviet Union's story is a cautionary tale of a sudden collapse. After decades as a rival superpower, the USSR dramatically disintegrated in 1991, almost overnight on the historical scale. One day it was a vast communist empire, the next day 15 independent countries. These examples show a pattern. Economic hegemons rise, and they fall. Sometimes through war, such as Britain and 2 world wars, sometimes via internal implosions such as the USSR, sometimes gradually as others catch up. In each case, the world didn't end, it changed. Power shifted, new alliances formed, new opportunities and challenges arose. So what about the United States? Let's talk about America's position today, and why many believe its long-term dominance will eventually fade. Don't panic. We're not talking about a Mad Max scenario next Tuesday, but a gradual shift over decades. Is America really bound to decline? The idea might sound unpatriotic or pessimistic, but it's grounded in historical trend lines and hard data. Here are a few key points to consider. No one stays on top forever. As we've seen, every great power in history, from the Romans to the British, sooner or later, gets knocked off the podium. The US is subject to the same historical laws of gravity. In the late 1980s, historian Paul Kennedy famously warned that American hegemony could wane as its military commitments outgrew its economic base. That debate kicked off in the 80s, and it's only become more relevant today. America's shrinking share. One simple reason the US will eventually lose its #1 status is the rise of others. In 1960, at its peak, the US made up a whopping 40% of the world's economy. Today that share is about 25 to 26%. In other words, the US portion of global GDP has nearly halved since the post-World War II Golden Age. This isn't because America got poorer. The US GDP has grown a lot since 1960 in absolute terms. Rather, other countries grew faster, increasing the size of the overall pie. As of 2023, the US accounts for roughly a quarter of global output, still huge but no longer half the pie. And by some measures, the transition has already happened. If you compare economies in purchasing power parity terms, China is already larger than the USA. China and the new challengers. It's hard to discuss America's future without mentioning China. With 1.4 billion people and decades of rapid growth, China has long been forecast to overtake the US in nominal GDP. While growth has leveled off a bit, most experts still see China becoming #1 within a decade or so, at least in total economic size. By 1916, the US had surpassed Britain. By the 2020s, China is on track to surpass the US. The point is, the US now lives in a much more competitive multipolar economic world. Internal strains. Great powers often fall partly due to problems at home. The US has its share of long-term issues, a growing national debt, political polarization, infrastructure that needs major improvements, and so on. These aren't fatal in the short term, but over decades they could weigh on America's ability to invest in the future. Additionally, inequalities in wealth and internal conflicts can sap a nation's strength. Ray Dalio's research on empire cycles notes that internal conflict and debt tend to rise in declining phases. Sound familiar? The US has seen rising political divisions and debt levels in recent years, It's a sign that maintaining dominance gets harder when you're busy fighting inside the house. Now, before anyone writes off the United States, let's balance this with some perspective. Decline doesn't mean collapse. The US isn't about to fall off a cliff economically the way the Soviet Union did. In fact, there are strong reasons to believe that when America's dominance does recede, it will be a slow, gradual fade. More like the graceful aging of a champion, not a sudden heart attack. Let's explore why. The US economy is deeply woven into the fabric of the global economy, far more than the Soviet Union ever was. The dollar is the world's primary currency. US banks, markets, and tech companies are intertwined with businesses and investors across the planet. For example, the US dollar makes up about 58% of global central bank reserves, by far the largest share. Trillions of dollars of trade are priced in USD, and international loans are often in dollars. This gives the US a kind of buffer. No one wants to see the American economy implode because it would drag everyone down with it. The world has a vested interest in managing and mitigating America's decline, not precipitating a crash. Another reason the US won't fall fast is that it's not a classic colonial empire with restive colonies ready to bolt. The US is a unified nation-state. There is no equivalent of India 1947 waiting to secede and instantly shrink America's economic base. Joseph Nye pointed out that unlike Britain, the US doesn't have an overseas empire that could suddenly slip away. The American empire has been more about alliances, military bases, and influence, which can wane, yes, but those aren't the same as losing literal territories that contributed labor and resources. The Soviet Union's rapid fall involved 15 republics breaking apart. Nothing similar is on the horizon for the USA. The US economy, for all its challenges, remains highly diversified and innovative. This isn't a country dependent on just one or two industries that could go bust. America leads in technology, finance, entertainment, aerospace, biomedical research, higher education, and more. US companies like Apple, Google, Microsoft, and Tesla are global trendsetters. American universities attract talent from all over. This gives the US a resilience. It can adapt and reinvent parts of its economy as old sectors decline. Remember, people once worried Japan would eclipse the US in the 1980s when US car makers struggled, then Silicon Valley rose up and changed the game. While other nations have caught up in manufacturing or electronics, the US has often shifted to new frontiers. Decline, therefore, may be relative. The US might produce a smaller slice of the global pie in the future, but that pie might be much bigger, and with many American innovations baked in. Here's a wild card that pure GDP numbers don't capture: soft power. This is the term for a country's ability to influence others by attraction, through culture, values, and diplomacy, rather than force. The United States has been a soft power superpower, from Hollywood movies and Netflix shows to blue jeans, jazz and rock, fast food, and Facebook. American culture has a way of spreading globally. Even as US economic weight declines, its cultural influence might persist for a long time. English is the international lingua franca. American brands and universities remain highly regarded. Think of the UK. It lost its empire, but London still today is one of the world's financial and cultural capitals, and British music, literature, and TV are beloved worldwide. Similarly, the US will likely remain a cultural trendsetter and center of innovation, even if it's no longer the biggest economy. That continued soft power gives the US leverage and relevance that outlasts raw GDP rankings. It also means the world is acclimatized to American ideas and presence, which could smooth the transition to a post-American leadership era. To sum up, the fall of the US in economic terms is likely to be gradual and managed, not a freefall. One historian compared America's situation with Britain's and found key differences. By 1914, Britain had fallen to fourth place economically and was over-reliant on an empire that soon broke apart, whereas the US today is still the single largest economy with no colonies to lose, and faces rivals that, while formidable, don't utterly dwarf it militarily. This suggests the US has more staying power. Decline in relative terms? Sure, it's already happening. Decline in absolute devastation? Unlikely, barring some unforeseen cataclysm. Visualize a future where the US is no longer the singular economic superpower but rather one big player among several. How does daily life change, if at all? It's not as night and day as you might imagine. Global economic impact. The US economy is a huge engine of global growth and consumption. As it grows relatively slower, other engines like China, India, Southeast Asia will drive more of global demand. Companies will increasingly cater to Asian and other markets. You might see more innovation coming out of those regions, more global brands that aren't American. The center of gravity of the world economy may shift eastward. This doesn't mean the US goes poor, it just won't hog as much of the spotlight. Life in America. Americans might feel a psychological adjustment more than an economic catastrophe. The US could remain very wealthy per person. In fact, on a per capita basis, the US is likely to stay ahead of China for a long time. It's easier to be rich per person with 330 million people than with 1.4 billion. So, an average American in 2040 might be living in a country that's second in total GDP, but still quite comfortable individually. The big difference is in international influence and perhaps in some privileges. For example, the US might not be able to dictate terms in every trade agreement or geopolitical standoff as it used to. There could be a loss of that post-Cold War era sense of being the world's sole superpower, international relations. One hopeful possibility is that the end of overwhelming US dominance could lead to a more collaborative international order. If no single country can go it alone, countries might strengthen global institutions like the UN, G20, etc., to solve problems collectively. We see some of this already. Even as US leadership wavers, others are stepping up on issues like climate change, trade, and regional security pacts. A more fragmented power structure might force nations to cooperate by necessity, which could be a good thing. Of course, there's the pessimistic view that a power vacuum leads to chaos or conflict, the Thucydides' trap idea that a rising power and ruling power often clash. But numerous analysts point out that war between nuclear-armed giants is in nobody's interest, and economic interdependence is a strong peacekeeping force, so perhaps we'll be smart enough to avoid a great power war and instead ease into a new equilibrium. Countries around the world will experience a mix of opportunities and challenges. Smaller nations might have more room to maneuver as big powers balance each other. No single hegemon telling them my way or the highway. On the other hand, they might also feel pressured to choose sides at times, as some feel now between US and China. Currencies might fluctuate more if the dollar is less dominant. Culturally, there could be an even richer global blend, not just American movies and music, but more Bollywood, Nollywood, Chinese cinema, K-pop, Turkish TV dramas, etc. In terms of tech standards, internet governance, etc., multiple models might coexist. For global citizens, the change might feel gradual, like slowly no longer taking for granted that the US sets all the trends or that English is the default language for everything. But don't worry, English isn't going anywhere in our lifetimes, and Americans will still be around. Just maybe a tad less loud. Now about that silver lining we promised, here it is. The fall of the US economy, in relative terms, can be seen not as a failure, but as a natural progression towards a more balanced world. It's actually a sign of success in many ways. Success of other nations developing and lifting their people out of poverty, success of globalization spreading prosperity. It's also a chance for the US to reinvent itself. Remember, Britain after its imperial heyday became a modern social democracy and a cultural powerhouse in new ways. The United States, as it relinquishes some hegemony, could renew its democracy. Maybe less temptation to overstretch abroad means more focus on unity at home, and become a more normal nation that cooperates with others on equal footing. And for the world, a future where no single country dominates could be more fair and stable, if we play our cards right. In the end, the story of America's economic decline might be less of a tragedy and more of a bittersweet coming of age. Every empire must learn to become just one of the gang eventually. The British learned to sip their tea without ruling the world, and they're doing all right. The US can learn to thrive without being the undisputed boss, and who knows, Americans might even find life a bit less stressful when they're not trying to carry the entire free world on their shoulders all the time. For now, let's take the long view, keep our seatbelts fastened for a slow ride down, and remember, in this big interconnected world, every decline opens the door to a new rise. The US had its rise, and someday its decline will make room for others, but together, we all rise in the larger arc of human progress. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more insightful takes on big global shifts. Until next time, stay curious and stay hopeful.